At first glance, the hunter appears as another semi-mindless monster who exists solely to inflict terror and violence on those that cross his path. I mean, I can see why anyone would think that way. The creepy decrepit shack, the hooks and cages and all manner of cutting tools laying around. And of course, there's his appearance as well. Tall and hulking, he stalks the wilderness and its surrounding areas, hunting six and mono down. As we've seen in game, if we happen to mess up, the hunter has no problem with blowing us away with his trusty shotgun. But perhaps his relentless pursuit of us doesn't stem from some mindless bloodlust at the mere sight of our two heroes. I theorise that the hunter isn't indiscriminately out for blood, but that he is in fact protecting his neck of the woods from the outside world. Before we dig into that theory, let's first take a look at the hunter himself and set the scene. As far as other antagonistic enemies appear in Little Nightmares, the hunter is one of the more outwardly normal in appearance. Besides the sack that covers his face, everything about his appearance is befitting of a simple hunter. There's nothing even physically outstanding and monstrous about him like the janitor or the doctor. He appears as an average man, maybe a little taller than the average resident of the Pale City, but that's about it. Now then, it's sometimes hard to see, but you may notice that on various parts of the hunter's body, there's tufts of stuffing poking out, on his shoulder and his abdominal area most prominently. So if he was a completely normal guy, then we could brush this off as maybe being his coat, which could be old and worn out. However, given that he is a known taxidermist based on what we see throughout his shack and from official literature, we can be confident in speculating that the hunter may have to make amends to himself from time to time. It looks more like he is leaking this stuffing. What do I mean by making amends? Well, I'd like to touch upon two possible events from the hunter's past, prior to the rise of the signal tower. Both of these theories involve the transmission and it affecting the hunter, much in the same way it has affected so many others within the Pale City. It warped their minds, altered their appearances, drove them insane, and even drove others to death, and to possibly seek help in the worst of places. Perhaps the hunter did seek help of a sort. In my last video I speculated that the doctor was sought out by those wanting a reprieve from the transmission's effects. If that is true, then maybe the hunter was among those sorry patients at some point, and perhaps was one of the few to leave that infernal hospital, fleeing as far away from the Pale City as he could, and settling in the wilderness at some point. His laboured breathing and hidden face could hint at prior treatment from the doctor. His body has never been fully healthy since. If this is to be believed, then perhaps for a time the hunter found peace with a family that lived away from the prying eyes of the tower and from the chaos of the Pale City, living as a refugee of sorts. Of course, at some point things went wrong, as evident by the guts and bodies and stuffed corpses in and around the shack. I speculate that the family posed around the dinner table could have brought the hunter in, but eventually succumbed to the transmission themselves, and the hunter's only option was to kill them off before they too became monstrous, faceless viewers, or worse. Judging by the family's appearance, we can see the man and the boy look mostly normal, but the woman was already heavily affected. The same fate probably befell the lady in the attic, and the others bagged and buried in the area. If the wilderness really was compromised as I speculate, then it seems that the hunter was forced to cleanse it, if you will, by killing off anyone around, and burying them when he could. You may notice that compared to everywhere else in the game, television sets are scarce around the wilderness, and in fact can only be found in the starting area, seemingly thrown away and abandoned, probably dumped there by the hunter. There is one other television laying away from the shack, again abandoned and useless to anyone, and he has no problem obliterating it in the pursuit of six and mono. Besides the televisions that we see rarely in the wilderness, you may notice that some are lying in the waters that separate the wilderness from the Pale City. These could just be leftovers from the Pale City itself, or perhaps once again, in keeping with the theory, the hunter threw them into the ocean to get rid of them, and they're just sort of laying there. So that's one possibility. The other similar but with some variations. Perhaps the hunter was once again affected by the transmission, but was already living outside of the Pale City in the shack. Like the others, he was physically and mentally altered by the signal, but not so much that he couldn't pull it together and rid the surrounding area of any televisions, and more disturbingly, of any and all would-be viewers and trespassers, by whatever means necessary. It seemed the hunter lives a reclusive lifestyle, aware and afraid of the twisted world outside of his hovel in the woods. Anytime a trespasser or potential viewer encroaches upon his territory, he takes them out, often in brutal fashion. This would explain the numerous gut-filled traps and the cages and corpses lying around the area. If the hunter cannot keep them away, then he must eradicate them totally, and use their deaths as a deterrent to anyone else thinking twice about entering his domain. It's a harsh world, and if we lean towards the theory that the hunter is somewhat of a tragic character, then we have to take a look at his humanity. The natural assumption, as we've discussed, is that the hunter is another killing machine terrorizing the world of Little Nightmares, based upon the surface level presentation of him we see in the game. But look a little closer and perhaps you'll begin to see that he's just another person trapped in a harsh and unforgiving situation. And much like Six and Mono, who've done questionable things to stay alive, he is a survivor. At some point, the hunter became disheartened and lonely in a cruel world. He was probably tired from all the killing and running. At first glance, the stuffed corpses posed around the dinner table seem odd, but if we think about it for a second, the hunter is probably just trying to keep himself from going insane by posing these corpses around the shack, so that his little part of the wilderness isn't so dark and devoid of life, at least on the surface. Perhaps these people were once relatives or even friends of his, and he can't bear to see them go, as grim as that may seem. It makes sense then that when the hunter found Six, rather than killing her he kept her alive. She is just a child after all, and if we look at how every other adult or creature in this world reacts to kids, I'd say the hunter is an okay guy in comparison. We know Six is a hungry girl, so she was clearly being fed. She even has a music box for entertainment as well. If we look back at the comic book series, as short-lived as it was, we can see that music boxes are something Six likes a lot. And this is further cemented in the end section of Little Nightmares 2, where her boss fight is built around a music box. Also, Six is smart and sneaky, and able to get the best of a bad situation and escape it. So to say that a flimsy wooden board with holes in it would keep her locked in the basement would be an overstatement. Perhaps Six became content living a quiet life within the walls of the hunter's shack. After all, she at least seems for a time safe from the crushing horrors of the outside world. I imagine initially Six would have ran from the hunter, as anyone would, because of his appearance and the general distrust children would have in such a world. However, after being captured and, in this case, possibly protected, she was fine with staying put. We can see from the scratches on the wall of her room that Six has been there for over 40 days at least. For all we know, she and the hunter probably had a shared understanding of the world they both found themselves in. So, why does Six leave with Mono then if she's safe with the hunter, supposedly? I think it maybe boils down to the overbearing violence and approaching doom present in the wilderness, and that's something that Six recognises and sees coming. We can see a chalk drawing of the signal tower on the wall of her room, and given that she's been around the hunter long enough to see him do horrible things just to survive, and that all these things are connected to the signal tower and its growing influence throughout the world, perhaps she took the opportunity to leave with Mono when it presented itself, in the hopes of ending up somewhere better. Six, after all, is certainly not beyond abandoning people once they've outlived their usefulness. Even the wilderness isn't safe from the reach of the tower. And if Six and Mono weren't the ones to best the hunter, then perhaps the ever-present and approaching forces in this dark world would have caught up with him eventually. Who's to say he's even really dead? He could still be out there, holding fort in this nightmare world, once again patching himself up and getting ready for the hunt, and doing what he can to hold off the tides of evil brought forth by the signal tower.